So the topics that we're going to be covering today, I don't want to overcomplicate matters. So I've tried to condense my advice down to key elements. So regarding networking, I will discuss how to set your networking goals and routes to achieving them, which will include establishing your offering and initiating dialogues, and how to ensure action and progression in the future. With respect to online presence, I'm going to talk about recognizing opportunities to build your online presence and executing them effectively. And throughout the presentation, I will be using examples of my own experience to highlight points that I'm making. So, what is networking and why do it? So, the Google Dictionary, who probably stole it from a real dictionary, states that networking is the action or the process of interacting with others to exchange information and develop professional or social contracts. Essentially, that means you're building mutually beneficial relationships. Why do we do it? Well, in my opinion, we do networking to expand the scope of our capabilities as individuals. So we have to accept that we have technical limitations. So we can't be an expert at everything. We've only got one pair of hands, only got 24 hours in the day, etc., etc. We also have knowledge limitations. And so by networking and collaborating, we can become introduced to new ideas and new ways of thinking. And for me, this is really exciting, and it helps me to enjoy the process of being a scientist much more. And I imagine it's the same for many others. So it's important to network and collaborate, because if you want to make it to the top of the tree in academia, then you will need to learn how to collaborate effectively. In modern science, the best progress is made and all the top papers are published when diverse collaborations are undertaken between fields such as biomedical science, engineering, environmental and social sciences, as well as inclusion of private companies and governments in an attempt to solve the most important problems that exist in the world today. As they say, no man or woman is an island. So when we've decided we need to network, how do we go about it? So we need to set some goals, especially if you've got a preformed idea of someone you want to network with. So who do you want to network with? Professor X. I love their work. They're my idol. Why do you want to network with them? Like I say, they're my idol. I want to be them. What do you envisage is the outcome? We can do some sciencing together and get a great paper out. Now, these are all very honourable reasons for networking with people, and enthusiasm is good, but it's probably best not to act like a fan when you want to develop a working relationship, a professional relationship. So I would adjust these slightly. I would just say, I want to work with Professor X. I love their work. They're in my field. Why do you want to network with them? So this is where the biggest change comes in. I have a great idea that could be investigated with the marriage of both of our complementary skills and resources. And the outcome remains the same. There's absolutely nothing wrong with wanting to do some sciencing together collaboratively and get a great paper out. It's why we all exist in the science world. So how do we go about doing that? So if we want to speak to a professor, if we want to speak to someone in our field about doing a collaboration, then it's probably important. Bear in mind, they're probably very busy. It's probably important to come up with some specifics. So before you go to a meeting, think about a loose plan that you could enact for the generation of pilot data in order to test the viability of any potential in-depth study. For example, what might a first experiment look like? Also, how would it work logistically? For example, what reagents would be required? Would materials need to be shipped? And what sort of investment would it require from each party, both in terms of time and finance? So an example of this was recently I was at the Future Physiology meeting, and I looked at the program beforehand, and I was very much looking forward to meeting one of the keynote speakers because I was familiar with their work, and I actually had an idea of how their work and my work could be blended to investigate what I thought was a potentially novel hypothesis. And so I went to the meeting, I watched their talk, I went and spoke to them afterwards, and indeed it turned out that nobody in this person's inner sanctum had thought about this idea, and he was very, very enthusiastic about following it up. And so that was the start of a collaboration that I'm currently engaging with. So I mentioned there that I went to speak to this person. Now, for me, that's quite straightforward. I'm quite a gregarious, outgoing person. But I know that I'm perhaps the exception rather than the rule, especially when it comes to early career researchers. So it's probably very important that if you want to approach Professor X, that you know what you want your opening gambit to be. What's your opening line? Practice the first sentence that you will say to this person. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and that will help give you the confidence and assuredness to deliver it properly and to start engaging in discussion. And I've put here that flattery will get you everywhere, and this is absolutely true. It's absolutely fine to go up to someone and say, "That was a really fantastic talk you gave. I've been following your work. Your science is inspiring to me." And actually, what I like to do this because I think that this actually disarms the person you're talking to, not in a cynical way, but you present yourself as an ally. You present yourself as someone who's enthusiastic. And an example from my past when this has happened was there was a meeting that I went to specifically because there was someone there that I wanted to go and see talk with the idea of potentially setting up a working relationship. And so I had a question prepared for this person. And after the talk, I approached this person and said that I had come to the meeting specifically to see them speak, and that it was worth the trip and the investment in doing so, and I hadn't been disappointed by their talk. And whilst this might sound a little bit cringeworthy, I was genuine in my praise. And then we were able to talk quite convivially and openly about the science, and we had an enthusiastic conversation on the subject matter. And I was able to ask if they considered some other questions that, again, might be novel hypotheses. And they said that they would like to consider these questions, but unfortunately, they didn't have the means. And it turns out that I did have the means. And so our complementary skills merged. And so what we did then is we began planning extensively using mostly an online mind map, which we could both access and edit at our leisure. Which brings me on to the aftermath. So in terms of staying in contact, it's important for you to take the lead in establishing sustained contact. Bear in mind, if the person that you're contacting is more senior, then you will have more time than them. So you'd be the first to initiate the emails and do so soon after the meeting so that your conversation is fresh in everybody's mind. Now, indeed, it might be the case that your schedules and resources are such that it's not logistically possible to do something practical immediately. And so if this is a case, as I explained in the previous slide, perhaps set up an online mind map where you can share ideas and progress the project intellectually, if not empirically. And you need to also be realistic about what you can do. So if, like me, you're working under a project grant as a postdoc, then in theory, 100% of your time should be dedicated to that. So it's important to keep an open line with your supervisor, your line manager, and see if you can leverage some time to explore this other thing. Because if you do, it may end up being the spark for a fellowship proposal if you're at that stage, or you may be able to get your new collaborator to co-write a grant for them to supervise you on, and you might find your next job. So that's quite a structured way of approaching the networking question, and it will help you if you've got a preformed idea of someone you want to talk to. But actually, I think it's really important to be open to spontaneity as well. So not all of your networking ambitions need to be pre-planned. And it's important to be open to suggestions from others, be prepared to discuss ideas that emerge spontaneously. And this actually means that, you have to be able to listen and digest as well as talk about your own ideas. And so you have to think on the spot. And so it's actually important to maybe develop those skills as well and do reading around the subject areas that are important to you and make sure you're well read. And one example I've got is actually perhaps my favorite example of this session. I sit on the conferences committee at the Physiological Society. And at one of my first conferences committee meetings, the spark for one very exciting collaboration was generated by an off-the-cuff conversation that I had during the lunch break. I'm not going to go into full details. It's quite a long story, but subsequently, I've been on a field trip to track down Greenland sharks in the sea off the north coast of Denmark, which was absolutely incredible and amazing. I had a whale of a time, cue the tumbleweed, but ultimately, I wouldn't have had that opportunity. It's outside of my immediate field of expertise, but I wouldn't have had that opportunity if I wasn't open to spontaneous networking. Okay, so I'm going to draw a line under the networking element of this webinar right now, and I'm going to move on to curating your online presence. So in 2020, I think it's fair to say that it's important to have an online presence, and it's an important part of being a scientist. But I think it's also firstly important to be good at what you do. So concentrate on being a scientist, be an expert in your field, and publish your work. And I know that last thing is easier said than done, and it might depend on circumstance, it might depend on the type of lab that you're in and what your lab's publishing habits are. But it's important to try and start making your name as a scientist. So you want to be searchable on PubMed. This is the first place you should look to be online. And other scientists will formulate their opinion of you based on your outputs, and it's important to be respected by your peers before heading for Joe Public. And in the same vein, I would advise setting up a Google Scholar account and maintaining it. I'm actually surprised by the number of established scientists that don't have a Google Scholar account maintained. So once we've become a scientist and we're good at being a scientist, where else can we be visible online? And so the possibilities are endless, as they say. And so here are a few examples. These are the really mainstream examples. So, there are Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and they're really your core social media platforms. But, there's also YouTube, personal blogs and websites and podcasts, which offers things that are a little bit different. And so which one should you choose? And how should you approach generating an online presence? And I think a lot of this actually comes down to personality. What I would suggest is giving everything a try. But if something doesn't work for you, it doesn't seem to be working for you, then don't spend too long trying to persevere. It's best to maybe move on and find a format that suits you better. Take me, for example. I'm not a big lover of Facebook. I don't like it at all, and I don't think it's a very good platform personally for scientists, individual scientists, to use. And I've never used Snapchat, so I can't speak to that too much, but it doesn't appeal to me. With Twitter and Instagram, I view them very similarly. I have the same name on Instagram and Twitter. And I use them, but I don't use them that regularly. And they have a certain utility for me, which is that I like to glean information from them mostly rather than give something out there. And I don't think I could ever invest enough time to become someone who's hugely followed or influenced on social media. What I really do like is more long form content, so things like videos and podcasts, and these are the things that I really enjoy getting involved with, and I think they fit well with my life and my work life. So when you've decided where you should go to, when you've decided who you should go to, you have to then decide who you want to appeal to. So do you want to appeal to the general public? I think 90% of scientists would probably say yes to that question. And it's important for us to share useful information for everybody, to engage the public in science and encourage enthusiasm for science within the general public. And this is important because all of our funding comes from the public. So whether you're charity funded or you're research council funded, your money comes from the public donations, or it comes from the public purse, through taxations. And so I think it's important to engage with the public. But it's important also to understand that there are caveats to doing that. And that is essentially that you're straddling two different domains. So scientists will often be quite critical of people engaging with the public, and they will kind of pick upon your accuracies, for example, which is something you need to think about. And it is something that if you are going to engage with the general public, you are putting your head above the parapet. And you will have to be aware that a certain resilience is required. I think you learned about resilience last week. A certain resilience is required to do that. Other than that, you might just want to use it as a personal networking tool, so engaging with other scientists. It's also, social media is very useful for keeping up with all the latest developments, finding the latest papers in your field, and also looking out for meetings. So when you've decided who you want to appeal to, you have to decide how you want to come across. So do you want to be omnipresent? Do you want to deliver short, sharp contributions, sharing information and content on a regular basis and constantly engaging in online debate? Or are you more the kind of person that wants to make occasional appearance? So this would include a more considered approach, perhaps generation of slightly longer form content, or are you someone that sits somewhere in between? And I think this last point is probably where most people will sit, but you may veer towards one extreme more than the other. So what do we do then? So you need to work out how to generate content. And a good way to do this is to find someone you like, someone who you admire, someone who you want to be a little bit like, and try and to some degree replicate their style. And I've included a couple of examples here. And these are essentially the two polar extremes of long form documentary making and social media. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but David Attenborough is a national treasure. But ultimately, they are both excellent at what they do. So again, you will probably sit somewhere in between, on the spectrum in between, but you might veer to one side more than the other. But when you've decided this, you need to understand what tools and skills you might need to achieve this. So, for example, if you want to be on social media mostly, then you probably need a smartphone and fast thumbs, maybe a good camera on your smartphone. But if you want to do something a bit more long form and considered, then you might need to invest time and money into premium recording devices, cameras. You might need to buy an editing suite and develop some editing skills. But ultimately, what you need to do in order to stand out is you need to try and be innovative. And you need to try and find unoccupied spaces and do something a little bit different to get noticed. Okay, so let's talk about generating content a bit more in the form of social media posts. So I'll preface this by saying that I think a lot of these lessons are transferable between long form and short form, but ultimately the content is king. So will anyone find your content interesting? And often when I'm making social media posts, I'll get halfway through and I'll be like, I'll get bored of my own post. I'll be like, this is not interesting. So that often is something that stops me from posting. But if you've decided that what you have to say is interesting, then you need to make it accessible. You shouldn't be using technical jargon or ridiculous acronyms. And ridiculous acronyms are my absolute pet peeve. I absolutely hate them with a passion. And so don't use them. Another point is that, can you link your content to a topical issue? Now, some people might see this as quite cynical, especially if your topical issue can be, revolve around health, and it can be quite sensitive. But actually, often you will be, as a scientist, the expert in your field. And so if you are the expert in your field, then you will know a lot more than newsreaders. You will know a lot more than columnists and the general Twitterati. And so it's important for you to put yourself forward as an expert in this field. People might see it as cynical, that you're, increasing your profile through a negative event. But it's important. For example, a colleague of mine who works in infectious disease, I would actually say, that she's cashing in on coronavirus. So it's important for you to put yourself forward. Don't be shy about it. Can you make your tweet stand out or your Instagram post stand out? So, is it lighthearted? Can you make it humorous? Is it really interesting? Can you heighten the curiosity? Find ways to do this. Does it have a health impact? Is it related to a catastrophe? These are all things that will grab attention, which is what this whole process is all about. And on that point, use of video clips and images are also attention grabbing, and hashtags are essential for maximum exposure. Now, to be a top Twitterer, it's my understanding that you must tweet constantly. So we're talking about 5 to 10 per day of top quality content. Now, for me, I would say that that's probably a full-time job, and I feel that would be too distracting from my day-to-day in the lab. And so it's probably a reason that I don't do it. But if you want to do it, then, and you want to become very, very well known on Twitter, then this is perhaps something to bear in mind. So a couple of examples of what I think are good, and I won't say less good, but I would say I'm a little bit indifferent about. So on the left here, we've got a post by the Physiological Society. And indeed, I'm showing my colors now. And what they've done is they've used on this day. So it's, it's relating back to a moment in history. It's relatable. They've used full words throughout. And so it's very easy to understand what is being spoken about. And then there's a really nice animated video, vivid colors. It's got a couple of take-home messages, and it's about 20 seconds long, which I'd say is probably the absolute extreme of anybody's attention span on Twitter. On the right, we've got one from the European Society of Cardiology. Now, I am a member of the European Society of Cardiology, so I feel like they should be speaking to me. And I looked at this picture, I thought, that's a beautiful picture, that's some amazing imaging, what's going on there? So I started reading, and it's just full of acronyms. And so at that point, and I tried to work out what I thought they might be. As someone in the field, I thought maybe I should know what they are, but there are just too many for me to get my head around. And so actually, I disengaged. Now, I don't think it's necessarily a bad tweet. It's obviously a tweet that was directed at a very specific audience, cardiologists, rather than basic science working in cardiovascular. But at the same time, I'm a member of their society. They try and cater for basic scientists. And there's a question there of whether you should be targeting subsections of your followership. But that's a conversation for another day. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about what I think is probably my bread and butter, which is generating medium and long form content. So we're talking about YouTube, podcasts, and blogs. Ultimately, many of the same rules apply. So, your output needs to be accessible to a wide audience. But in this case, it can carry much more intellectual content. And you can use some jargon, just some, if the terms are explained with a simple clarity. And so medium form, I would consider something like a 3, 4, 5 to 10 minute video with 1 or 2 key take home messages, but it needs to be engaging, it needs to be fun, it needs to be snappy to keep people's attention. In terms of the long form, then we're talking more documentary style films or podcasts. And these are likely to involve a more in-depth look at the evidence base and counter theory, and they will often have multiple discussion points. And just conclude briefly by saying that networking is indeed crucial to a successful research career. And if you've got preformed ideas of who to network with, then it's good to be strategic and prepared, and especially if you are perhaps a little shy. But if you can, always try to be spontaneous to other opportunities as well. In terms of online presence, it's important. I think it's becoming more important to modern day scientists, but you need to be sure to be good at what you do and show that you are doing the basics properly. So you need to publish, you need to be searchable on PubMed. But ultimately, you need to focus on things that interest you the most and also suit your personality and your lifestyle and your working life. So this will help dictate whether you're doing the shorter, more frequent Twitter-style social media or whether you're doing more long-form content. And with that, I'd like to just thank you for coming onto the webinar and engaging, and just say that if you do want to connect, then you can find me either on my Twitter page at Dr. Dan Brayson. I'm also on Instagram at Dr. Dan Brayson, but you can also email me d.brayson@ucl.ac.uk. So at this point, I'd like to say that if there are any questions, fire away now. So one question that I have got here is just asking me really to expand on some specifics of these collaborations. So I think maybe this relates to the collaborations when I was talking about the one that I had at Future Physiology. So to expand on how that process is working and how that is moving forward. So I talked about blending a marriage of skills. And so this person had a model, this person has a model. And my idea was that this model might be a good model to test a certain molecular pathway. And I discussed this with this person. They said, yeah, no one's investigated this. This is a really good idea. I think we should do it. But they have the model. So they're the harbinger of this model. But what I have the tools. So I have some antibodies and some primers to investigate whether or not this model has this pathway activated. And so the way that is working is that because the tools work much better in my hands, this person is shipping over the material, the tissue from their institute to my institute. And I'm actually going to be doing that work whenever I can find a bit of time. So that's kind of how the logistics work. I hope that's quite clear. So let's have a look for something else. So would I recommend setting up separate personal and professional social media accounts? I think the answer to that is probably yes. And you don't necessarily need to do that in terms of having 2 Twitter accounts. Maybe you want to have a personal account on Facebook and a professional account on Twitter, for example. And I think actually Facebook is much better for your personal social online engagements than it is for science. And I think Twitter is much better for networking in your professional domain. So I would advocate that. And it just depends how you conduct yourself as well. I'm not saying anyone conducts themselves poorly, but it depends on what kind of content you discuss in your personal life, whether or not it's very relevant. If people start looking through your professional Twitter account and seeing umpteen posts about politics, then they're probably going to find that a little bit awkward. They might disengage. So I think it's a good idea, yes. Yeah, Twitter is absolutely. There's one question here: is Twitter a suitable tool to keep in touch with people I met in conferences, in courses? And absolutely, it is. Yes, I think it's probably easier keeping in touch on Twitter than it is via email, because you're always seeing how these people are, what these people are doing, and it might be clear to you, like if you've emailed them, but you can see that they're very busy at a conference, for example. It will be clear that they've not emailed you back because they're at a conference. And they've been tweeting about it. So I think Twitter is a really good tool for that. Would I recommend any training courses for social media? I don't know of any external. I think that actually your institutions are now beginning to understand that social media is a huge thing, and they actually run courses for social media for scientists. I know my institution does this. And so I would actually suggest that you go and have a look within your own institution, because then it will be very much specifically tailored to using social media as a scientist. So yes, there's another really good question here. So having an online presence is helpful, but it is often rigged with trolls. How do we circumvent that? There is only one way to approach trolls, and that is to block them and ignore them. So if you start engaging with trolls, then you're on a downward slope. You're on a slippery slope, a downward spiral. I would completely advocate blocking. And some trolls might insist that they have valid points, but ultimately, I think that if someone is trying to engage in reasonable debate, it will be clear. But if they start, being quite aggressive, then that is trolling. Even if they think they're right, then you don't have to engage with them. And also, often it might be another scientist that's giving you a lot of stick when you're trying to engage with the public. So it depends very much on the context of the post that you're making as well. So always have this in mind, but don't be afraid to block trolls. How much of my time do I put into my social media presence? So as I mentioned, I actually find, for example, Twitter, I find very difficult to constantly maintain my Twitter account, constantly putting content out there. But what I really like to do is to, go home at night and maybe spend some time, maybe even just as little as 20 minutes an evening, and developing ideas for longer form content and thinking how these are going to present. And then eventually, when you have a bit of time, a bit of space, you can really put some effort into this content, and then generate, for example, a YouTube video or a podcast. But I wouldn't be able to put an absolute on the amount of time that I do put into my social media presence. So, do I have any experience with LinkedIn and or ResearchGate? So, yeah, that's a good point. Actually, I didn't touch on these. So, I do have experience with these. So, I think LinkedIn is what I would say with LinkedIn. It's actually something that you can just set up, make sure it looks really nice. So, put a bit of time into it, and then you can just kind of leave it. And as long as you update it every now and again, if something significant within your work happens, or you get a paper out, then I think that's important to do. And it's almost like an online. I feel like LinkedIn is like an online CV, and I think this is a good way to look at it. So basically, what does your CV look like? Can you transfer that to LinkedIn? And then it's just there in perpetuity. It might be the case that someone can just find you, and then they might talk to you and offer you a job. I mean, I've been approached. I've been approached by a number of professional companies on LinkedIn, it just so happens that I'm hell bent on staying in academia, so it hasn't really been that useful. But if you're someone that is thinking about branching or moving over to out of academia into industry, then I think that's probably a really important thing to have a LinkedIn account. In terms of ResearchGate, I do have a ResearchGate account. I'm not quite sure how it works in terms of its metrics. I thought it was, the more papers you got, the more metric you got, but I recently had quite a big paper published, and then and my metric didn't change. So I'm not really sure how it works. But again, it's interesting because obviously, you can go and find papers. I think it works in quite a similar way to Twitter in terms of that. But actually, also the other day I was on there looking for some information about an assay that I was trying to perform. And I was trying to see what the general consensus was on a certain element of that assay. And I read the information, and someone had asked a question. It hadn't really been answered in a very helpful way. And I just did a bit of reading, and then I actually went back and put what I thought was a useful answer. But I think, again, it's got a utility. I think it's a very good platform. But again, you can become overwhelmed with the social media platforms, and I think it can be quite difficult to stay on top of all of them. So, coming back to LinkedIn, it's good in the sense that you can just basically use it as a CV and maybe just edit it every now and again. You don't have to go on there every day. Would I recommend public engagement training? I've never had it. So most of what I've learned about public engagement has come from reading blogs, has come from reading, by science communications people, it's come by watching people who I admire. So how do people that I admire conduct themselves, and how do people that I admire present when they're facing public audiences? And I try and recreate that. And so I've given a number of talks in the public space. I spend a lot of time actually, and this is something else to consider, that if you're going to go and give public talks, I spend a lot of time preparing for these. And I think that, having that rehearsal space and doing those rehearsals is really, really important. And also, if you see a lot of people that go and give talks, and they give, the people that do the rounds, that actually what they do is they often have one talk, and then they'll give it over and over and over again, because, that's absolutely fine, because most people that you go and give a talk to won't have seen that talk before. And so it's basically get a talk, practice a talk, and then go and give the talk, relentlessly, and really spread your message. Doing one talk isn't going to spread your message at all. Thank you, sir, for the presentation. You're welcome. For early career researchers, what are the requirements to be on PubMed? So you need to publish. That is literally, and whoever you publish with, whoever you publish in, whichever journal you publish in, has to be indexed on PubMed. So they're the requirements. It sounds quite straightforward, but I absolutely appreciate that publishing is very, very, very difficult. It takes many years to get to that stage. It's hard to hear me, apparently. Is that? I've got a few. I know that was earlier. They were early questions. Sorry. Right. Let's go back to more recent questions. How would you approach writing an online profile for best exposure to collaborators and other stakeholders interested in your research? So I think essentially I would try and approach this like writing a CV. So what I would do is I would perhaps write a little bit of blurb about what my interests are, about what I've contributed to the field. And then what I would do is I would, write a little bit about, the places that I've worked in, and also what outcomes I got from working in those places. So was there a paper? Were there some talks that I gave? Did I present at any conferences? And, like you're talking about maybe a one-page online profile. And again, it can go on LinkedIn. It can also go on ResearchGate. You can host your CV on ResearchGate. But essentially that first page is absolutely killer. So you need to really work on that. So maybe 5 or 6 lines about your interests and what you do. And then where you worked during a certain time. What was the outcome of working there? What outputs did you get? And then, if it's public engagement you want to do, for example, then maybe have some lines about how you engage with the public and how that integrates with your research. I think that's really important as well. So there's an interesting question here. So why is going to the pub so important for networking, and how can we change this? Because it is clearly so not inclusive. So that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I agree with the premise. It might be the case that you've experienced that, and if that is the case, then I'm very sorry that you've not had any more positive experiences in more neutral environments. Often I find that most networking is actually done. It's kind of done outside of meeting doors. So as soon as people leave meetings, they often start talking. And again, I mentioned during the webinar that I met one of my favorite collaborators at a conferences committee meeting here at the Physiological Society over lunch. So actually, I mean, okay, people will often say, have a drink or two to get the wheels, to grease the wheels. But actually, I think that you're at your most astute and you're most bright when you're completely free of that environment. And also, I find going to the pub a little bit hard because, I've actually in one ear, I have a bit of a hearing problem, and I find it very difficult to hear in spaces when there's so many echoey noises going around. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with the fact that going to the pub is so important for networking. And if it's the case that you haven't had any more better experiences, then I would try and use opportunities just outside of meetings and think, like those kind of opportune moments. And it comes back to this idea of spontaneity. You need to prepare to be spontaneous whenever you're in a meeting, whenever you're at a seminar, whenever you're at a conference. That's what I'm going to say about that. What would you say is the best way to go about setting up a blog in terms of starting and maintaining it? It's an interesting question. What I'm going to say is that if you want to start up a blog and maintain it, then you just have to put time into it. You have to practice writing constantly. But what I will say is that, unless you're going to make this your core extracurricular activity, it's very difficult to do it as a scientist, especially as an early career researcher. A lot of your time and a lot of your energy is going into experiments. It's going into, generating data and analyzing data, developing and designing new experiments. And I would actually, the advice I would give is just go and talk to societies, go and talk to the British Society for Immunology, go and talk to the Physiological Society, go and talk to your funding agency. For example, I've done blogs on the British Heart Foundation, and do one-off blogs. Do one-off blogs in places where you're actually going to get more exposure. And then perhaps when the time comes that you're very good at blogging and you've practiced a lot, and then you might find it easier to start and maintain a blog. So there's an interesting question here. Is an online presence important for successful grant and fellowship applications? I actually don't think it is, no. I really believe at this point that the main metric is papers. And if you've ever received any nominal grant funding that is in your name, then that is also very important. In my experience, and again, this is purely based on my experience, when I've presented my CV to people and I've said, I'm interested in a fellowship, and they look at my CV, and the first thing they do, and it's a little bit of a sad state of affairs because it doesn't really take into account the holistic individual in science. But what they do is they go straight to the back page. They go to the papers list and they just say, you need more papers, or you need a high impact paper. And actually, it speaks to the wider question about research culture and what metrics we are measured by. And I think that it's really, really important to start changing those, because as I said earlier, engaging with the public is really, really crucial, because they're the people that are paying for our research and they need to be involved. They're a stakeholder and they need to be involved, and they need to be involved from the beginning. We should be having, focus groups, I think, for a lot of our research. So, go and find out what kind of research people want to have done, rather than thinking, I've got a great idea, let's just go and do it. Without that desire to have that research in the pool, then why would you do that research? Is it arguably money not well spent? But at the same time, we're the experts and we know what we're doing to a certain degree. So again, it's about striking balance. How did I get my position on the conferences committee at the Physiological Society is a very good question. So the very first conference, Physiological Society conference I went to was in Cardiff in 2015, and I was made aware. I went to speak to the Physiological Society at their stand there, and I was made aware that they were setting up something called the Affiliate Working Group. And they just said, if you want to get involved with the society, if you want to help shape the society's outputs, then this is a really good thing to do. So I went and got involved with the Affiliate Working Group, and there was about 10 people as part of this initial group. And then as part of that, they wanted representation of the affiliates on each committee. So they asked people whether or not they would like to be part of a specific committee. And I said, yes, I would like to be part of the conferences committee. And that's kind of how the ball went rolling. So when you're at a conference, always go and talk to societies at their stands. Go and speak to the Physiological Society. Go and speak to the BSI. Whatever society it is that you're very interested in, go and speak to their representatives. They're always looking for people. One thing that struck me is that since I've become involved with the Physiological Society, is that because I'm engaged, they ask me to do so many things, and actually there are hardly any people that are taking up that level of engagement. And so if you're really keen to do that, there is definitely a space for you. Like they always need people to do things, and so you just need to get in contact. Maybe just drum up the courage, send an email to someone at the society that seems to be in the right department for what you're interested in doing, and ask if there are any opportunities. Thank you for your presentation. I found it very useful. Thank you. Is there anything specific that you would recommend for graduates in terms of approaching researchers when looking for research jobs, wanting to work in their labs, etc.? So yeah, I would recommend that you read up on the work of the person that you want to go and work with, and make sure you know their work inside out. Because if you do, and you can see avenues, again, it comes back to this idea of having an idea. So if you can see avenues where their work can be expanded, go and talk to them and say, I think your work can be expanded in this direction. And they'll say, well, we hadn't thought of that. That's a great idea. And then potentially, that PI will write a grant for you to go and work for them. Or at least you can co-write a grant. So that's a great way of sort of furthering your career. Find someone you like and go and talk to them, be well informed, and be enthusiastic. Thanks for the nice talk. This is another question. Thanks for the nice talk. Very useful. How soon, according to you, in your PhD, can I start approaching potential collaborators for ideas? Okay, so I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think there is a timescale for this. You have to be open to spontaneity, especially if the opportunity presents itself early on. You can at least say to someone, I really like your work. I'm not at a time now in my career where I can come and do something with you, where I can collaborate, where I can come and work for you, but I would really like to do it in the future. Can we maintain a contact? And then you can follow them on Twitter, and hopefully they will follow you back. And you will always know what projects are coming up if you follow them on Twitter, because anyone that is on Twitter will put their PhD projects on Twitter. You can also stay in contact and say, well, I'm, a couple of years later, say, oh, do you remember me from this meeting? Oh, well, I'm coming to the end of my PhD. I still really, really like your work and I would love to work with you. Can we perhaps talk about me coming to do a postdoc in your lab? Are there any potential projects coming up? Can we maybe discuss coming up with a project? So it's never too early to develop those connections. So I would very much encourage networking at any moment in time. And it's never too soon to start planning ahead. This is one thing I really, really have learned very, very slowly, and maybe a little bit too late, that it's never too late to start planning ahead. And actually having plans in mind for 2-3 years down the line really helps direct your day-to-day work and your energies towards that. Because unless you have that focus, then often you can kind of drift. And the one thing you don't want to do is get postdoc drift. And there's a really good book about that. It's called What Every Postdoc Needs to Know. So if you want to go and Google that, then please do.